Good afternoon. As you know, today is the 69th anniversary of the D-Day invasion in Normandy Beach in northern France. Today we have my friend Richard Urhahn here. He is a lifelong historian, specializing in World War II in general and Normandy Beach invasion specifically. So give a big Rotarian welcome to Richard Urhahn.
June 6th, 1944, 69 years ago, D-Day, or another name for it, was called Operation Urhahn. This was the largest seaborne invasion ever, and still to this day. The Germans were preparing for this invasion. They knew we were coming. They started in 1941, so they were very much prepared. The coastline was defended for 2,000 miles from Denmark to Spain. Our troops were preparing on the island of Great Britain. They had to cross the English Channel, which I'm sure all of us know was very, very treacherous. The English soldiers said about the fellow American soldiers, their allies, the problem with us was that we were overpaid, oversexed, and overheard. The supreme Allied commander was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He had two flamboyant generals under him that were really difficult to handle. The first being General George Patton, and the second one was the British General Montgomery. For months, we were doing photo reconnaissance on the beaches. Our Navy frogmen, which to this day we would call Navy SEALs, were going in. They were checking the coastline, where the best places to land, checking the soil if they could hold their tanks, etc. So there was quite a bit of preparation. The invasion could not take place without us having air supremacy. We gained that in 1944. Our troops would have been, it would have been dismal if we didn't control the air trying to land, obviously, on Normandy. Another thing that we needed for the landing was a harbor. And obviously, you know, we didn't have a harbor, so we floated over concrete squares, if you want to call them, called mulberries. And they would take these concrete squares and they would tie them together, and then we would sink them. And that was our harbor that we needed. Also, we needed a fuel source, and from Great Britain then we brought over, we run a if you want to call it a gas line or whatever, all the way from Great Britain underwater, all the way to the coast of France, and to keep our troops supplied. That was a feat in itself, obviously. We had to keep the Germans guessing on what we were doing, and we would allow them sometimes to intercept our own messages, and we wanted them to believe that we were going to land at the coast of Pas-de-Calais. That was the closest point to Great Britain, and that's where the Germans thought we were landing, and that's what we wanted them to think. So we did all these big elaborate deceptions that did work. At 1:15 a.m. our gliders went in on June 6th, and our gliders, also we had parachutists that went in behind the enemy lines. We wanted to get back behind the coastline and let them secure bridges and vital areas, and also for a little defense to keep the Germans off of us as we're attacking from the front. We started bombing the beaches, and we were talking about this earlier at the table. Unfortunately, the bombing that took place, there was a cloud cover. At this point in time, we had several instances where we bombed our own men, and we didn't want to take that chance, especially with all the ships that were out in the Gulf or in the harbor at that particular time. So the Air Force decided, well, wait a minute, I can't quite see down here, let's wait another second or two, and they did. So we bombed the heck out of behind the landing area and killed a bunch of cows and probably civilians, along with it. There was really little damage done as far as the German defenses. The German defenses were concrete pillboxes, very thick, and the bombardment that our ships did, along with the aerial bombardment, it had no effect. Basically, the Germans were able to go underground and get in these bunkers, and they were protected. But let me tell you something, when they opened their eyes through the fog and they seen the horizon full of ships, they were shocked. This invasion was a great surprise. Now, again, they knew we were coming, but all the weather was stating at this time that a big front was coming in, so even Rommel, the German commander, left the coast. Never thought it would happen, and nor did anybody else at that time. But Eisenhower had the guts, and the invasion was really scheduled for the day previous, and a couple of ships already took off. But the weather, again, was too inclement, and the ships turned back. The invasion should have been on June 5th. But anyway, our troops landed in Normandy, and they landed on 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Sword, and Juneau. The Germans, they kind of knew about where we might land because they knew the best particular areas, and those areas were fortified quite a bit better than some of the other areas. On Omaha Beach in particular, the Germans were up on the bluffs, and again, it was an absolute total slaughter. They were shooting down, and the proverbial saying, turkey shoot. Unfortunately, that's what it was. It was horrendous. Big slaughter. It was so bad, and I don't know if everybody knows this, but we were considering withdrawing from the beach from Omaha. Not the other 4, but from Omaha in particular. We really didn't secure it till right around lunch that day, and then again, we went in somewhere between 6:30 and 7 a.m. that morning. One of the turning points of the battle was a destroyer come in close, and he was told not to do that because of the shallowness of the harbor, and also because of the German guns. But he come in close, and he helped knock down some of these situations on the bluff that were impeding our moving forward. Another item that our men on the ground did, they moved on up to the seawall, and nobody moved because, again, it was a slaughter. You come out and the enemy's shooting down on us. After a little artillery support, several of the men grabbed what they called a Bangalore torpedo. It's not the torpedo what we think about. It's just a long tube with explosives on it that you just keep hooking pieces together, and you just keep pushing it forward, and they would push that under the barbed wire and then would blow up some of these obstacles to be able to advance in between these bluffs and anyway, get on top of the German soldiers. To me, one of the most interesting things was the British come up with all types of inventions because, again, we were preparing for this for quite a while. The British had these floating tanks, which looked like a tank with a little skirt around it, and we thought that was great, but there wasn't a single one of them made it to the Omaha beach. The problem was because the waves were so big, they would float, they would do what they wanted to, but it needed to be on calm seas. It was not calm that day, so they were swamped over. So we had no tanks. Imagine attacking these fortified positions with no tanks. So once the men again were at the seawall, and when they started advancing then, because of, again, the naval support and because of these Bangalore torpedoes, then how they took these positions was they, like a bunch of ants crawling up a hill, and they surrounded these positions, and that's basically how we gained the upper hand then on this particular beach. Another interesting point was the Germans had their reserves behind the lines, and so, again, you're defending 2,000 miles of coastline, so the Germans set up their their reserves, auxiliary, back behind. There was a big feud going on between Rommel, the German general, and Hitler, and also Ronstadt on where these reserves should be put. Rommel lost, Ronstadt won, and Hitler. So they moved the German reserves about 4 days' journey behind the line. Rommel was furious. He said the place to stop the Americans would be on the beach, and he was correct. So again, these reserves were 4 days back. The problem with all of this was that Hitler, unfortunately, or fortunately for us, was slept through the invasion. When this invasion started, we thought it was a diversionary attack. The Germans did, I'm sorry. They thought we were attacking, our main goal was the Pas-de-Calais. Again, because it was so much closer to the island of Great Britain. So we wanted them to believe that, but because of that, the Germans would not awaken Hitler. They allowed him to sleep because, again, they thought it was diversionary. And so Hitler was finally waking up at noon. By noon, all 5 beaches, the beachheads were secure. So that's when Hitler then said, okay, let's move up the reserves. Well, that sounds good, but they're a day away, and he's done missed half the day. The reserve soldiers advanced on their one-day journey to the front line. The problem with their advancement was it took them 4 days. The reason it took 4 days was because of our air power, and also because behind the lines we had the French resistance fighting for us, and some of our troops are still behind the line that parachuted in. But basically our artillery from the ships and the air power is what kept the Germans from getting where they needed to be. So after 4 days of advancing through Normandy, we made it 10 miles inland. We secured all the beachheads, and again, we had this whole area secure, and we're moving forward. Our advancement was slowed going through Normandy because of hedgerows. Now, our intelligence didn't mention anything about hedgerows, and we found out the hard way. And advancing, it was a natural defense. These hedgerows that the Germans had, it was like, the picture, it would be like a sunken road, and on each side of the road were hills. So again, this was a very good natural defense for these Germans, and they held us up quite a bit there. A problem with that is the particular tank that we used, and I brought samples of some of this stuff with me, was the Sherman tank. It was so inferior, unfortunately, to the German tanks. But when our Sherman tank would come up on these hedgerows, the bottom armor of our tanks was only 1 inch thick. So a rifle and machine guns were shooting through the bottoms of our tanks and killing our soldiers. One particular sergeant that was on the tank decided he had an idea. So all these beach obstacles that were set up, which a lot of iron and that stuck in the ground on the beaches, he went back and got, and we welded these on the front of these Sherman tanks, which was like a plow. And then we could hit those hedgerows with that particular plow and could just barrel us out a spot so that our tanks were no longer exposed going up like this. They were going through straight. The frontal armor on a Sherman was 2 inches, which still was better than 1. But anyway, that helped us get through these particular hedgerows. I'm looking here. I wrote down a few notes to make sure I didn't miss anything. One of the things, after advancing, once we got into this particular area, we come up to what they call the Fillet Gap, Falsey Gap. They got different names for it. But we trapped a ton of German soldiers. What this battle reminded me of was the Persian Gulf War, and when we had the Iraqis stuck on the highway going back to Iraq from Kuwait. They called it the Highway of Death. We did basically the same thing as we were advancing through Normandy, and we surrounded this particular pocket. We killed over 10,000 Germans, and we captured 50,000 prisoners, which then helped us propel the rest of the way through the country. I like some of Patton's sayings. Patton they used him on the Pas-de-Calais as a diversionary. The Germans thinking, and listen, they knew where we were at. They had their own people and their own spies knowing what was going on in Great Britain. We stuck Patton there, and that's why the Germans thought we were coming from that area. We did not allow Patton into the war because they were still mad at him from some other earlier instances that happened with him, with slapping a soldier in North Africa. But they allowed Patton to do his thing, and once we got established and got on the beaches. So Patton took off, and Patton liked to advance. Patton made comments. He never liked paying for the same real estate twice. He just wanted to go, go, go. The soldiers called him blood and guts. They would say, it's his guts and our blood. But he kept going. Another favorite phrase that Patton had was bypass and haul ass. And what that meant was on these very strong sites that he would just go ahead and go around and let the artillery and some of the back support coming in take care of them. The sad thing about all this, and you won't hear much of this, but after 3 weeks, basically we liberated the whole of France. And there were over 15,000 French citizens that were killed. And the unfortunate thing was that most of them were killed by our own men, by our own bombs and artillery, basically. So that's pretty well the battle. Just a couple things I just wanted to point out, and I brought a few things in for you. This is our helmet that we would wear. It's called the M1 helmet, and it's efficient, obviously. This is the German helmet, and this is a German SS helmet, which were their secret police. I don't know if you gentlemen and ladies can notice this, but see that design of that helmet? You know what we're wearing now? That's right. We call it a Kevlar helmet now with extra padding, etc. I brought in a grenade. This is basically the grenade that we would use. They'd pull the pin, they'd hold the little strap here, and this was a fragmentation grenade. So you were killed or injured by the fragments. I don't have a German grenade to show you, but they called it a potato masher because at that time that's what it looked like, a potato masher. The German grenade, when they would throw it, the concussion is what would kill you. Very little fragmentation, but the concussion. They would find our troops and they'd be dead and there wouldn't be a single mark on them, but their insides were tore up from the concussion. This is a 1944 model M1 Garand. This is the gun, semi-automatic, that General Patton said is what won the war as far as guns. The good thing about this gun, getting semi-automatic, where most of the German guns were, they had to cock them, and when you're taking it, you're cocking it, then you take your eye off. This particular gun, you just keep your eye on it, you just keep shooting. Semi-automatic. The German rifle was what they called a Mauser. One of the bayonets that they used on this gun, I brought two of them in here to show you. This is what we started the war with. See the size of this thing. They finally figured out that the guns were a little too long with this extra long bayonet. So what we did is we come up and we carved this bayonet down to a little smaller bayonet, which was a lot easier to maneuver and to handle the gun. Back to the M1 rifle. This is the bullets, 30-06, that you would put in with the bolt action here. And they would shove these bullets in. They had a saying back then, they called it M1 thumb. You had to push these bullets down and then release the bolt and get your thumb out of there before it shut. It didn't always happen, and there were a lot of bruised thumbs from it. The disadvantage of this particular gun, and the Germans knew it, shot 8 rounds. After the 8th round, you know what happened? Ping, and the little clip would come out. And the Germans could hear it. When it would go ping, they knew. A lot of them would jump up and start shooting in. So what a lot of soldiers did, they kept a couple empty clips like this. And they would shoot 4, 5, 6 rounds and would wait. Throw that clip down, that German thought, hey, he's out of bullets. He'd jump up and start shooting and they'd be ready for him. a lot of the soldiers would carry, obviously, extra ammunition, and I brought this in to show you. Besides what they wore on their belt, they would strap this around them and would carry extra ammo, along with everything else they carried, which really got quite heavy. A lot of the lieutenants, some tank commanders, mortar crews, and that used the M1 rifle. Excuse me, they called it the M1 carbine. Most of them called it a carbine. This was a lot lighter rifle, a lot lighter, obviously, than what the M1 Garand was. The advantage of this was it shot the same bullet that their .45 caliber pistols that they carried. So you used one ammo for both particular guns, which was convenient. Late getting into late 44 into 45, they also come out with the banana clip. This started right at the end of World War II, and then obviously continued into the Korean War. But this particular clip was obviously very helpful. My uncle in Urhahn, Missouri, I know this young lady, he never would tell me this story, but I found out from another uncle in the Korean War, this is the gun that he carried. He would take this clip, stick it in here, and then he would take another clip and tape it onto the side of it like this. So when he would shoot and that clip was done, flip him over, shove the other side in, which gave him 60 rounds. That was during the attacks of the Koreans and the Chinese, and he burned up several barrels, but again, he was one that he would never talk about it, but one of the uncles kind of filled me in on. The other thing I wanted to show you, here's your M1 Sherman tank. We were told this was the best, okay? Our tankers, when they come over, they knew it was great. There were a lot of good things about this tank, and then there were some bad things. This particular tank could outrun everything. Well, it should. Now, how would you like to come up against something like this? Can you see the difference? Okay. The Germans had two, towards the end of the war anyway, they had the Tiger and the Tiger 1. These things were so dominant over what we had. The only chance that we had with this particular Sherman tank, again, was like swarming around the German tanks. But basically, we'd call in the artillery. And because this tank shot a low velocity shell, could not penetrate the German tanks. Again, 2 inches of armor in the front, on the side, underneath was 1 inch. This German tank had 4+ inches in it. Another thing, look at the Tiger tank. Look at that slope. What do you think a shell's going to do when it hits the front? It's going to ricochet. That 4 inches gave it probably 6 or 7 inches of actual armor because, again, it was a sloping. Now, the Germans did a lot of things, but they stole this idea from the Russians. The sloping armor, because the sloping armor made their armor more efficient. So our little tanks going up against this German tank, it was a disaster. It really was. And so often when a shell or even bullets, if they penetrated the bottom, when they would go inside this tank and the shrapnel, it would just go around and around and around, and it would absolutely destroy the bodies. And anyway, it was terrible. It was so bad in some fronts that when our troops would advance, they would send, if you want to call it a tank wrecker, in to remove all of our destroyed tanks. So when our troops advanced, they wouldn't be demoralized. I brought in 2 soldiers here, how they would have been dressed during the war. The American, obviously the German. If you'll notice the German with the camouflage, the Germans were masters in camouflage, so much better than us. And again, the helmet that they wore. But one thing I wanted to point out, the rifle that he's using, it's just real similar to the AK-47. This is the assault rifle that the Germans come out with in 1944. Hitler didn't want them to have it. They used the term machine pistol and everything else just to get it through, so Hitler would maybe not bring light to it. But that particular gun is the beginning of the assault weapon. The Russians then copied this gun, and that's where the AK-47 got going and established. Again, I've got our other guns in that. And then the final thing I just want to point out are the planes that we use. Where I told you the gun that Pat said won the war for us, the M1 Garand, this is a particular plane that allowed us to grab air supremacy from the Germans. What we did with this is the P-51 Mustang. With our engine in it, it was a good plane, but it was not, as far as altitude, it didn't perform very well. So what we did with our P-51 Mustang is we took the the British Rolls-Royce engine, and we put it in this plane, and we made a monster out of it. The other thing that we did, if you'll notice, the fuel tanks on it. We hung two 300-gallon fuel tanks on both wings, okay? And the reason for all of this is so we could fly all the way to Germany and all the way back, so we could bomb Germany. Another thing they did with this plane, well, you can see the D-Day markings. That's another thing I want to point out to you. This is what we would do with white stripes and black stripes. So we would make sure that we knew who was on our side and who wasn't, especially starting D-Day. That's when they come up with these invasion stripes. Also with this particular plane, we put another fuel tank right behind the pilot. Now, they didn't like that a whole lot, but we did. That particular fuel tank had to be burned off before they even burn out the auxiliary fuel tanks, because the plane was very hard to handle and very unstable. So we loaded this thing down with fuel. Another thing with these fuel tanks that why I feel like our planes were better, they were what they call self-sealing fuel tanks. So if we took a hit, that the plane wouldn't explode. And what a self-sealing fuel tank is a fuel tank that has a rubber bladder in it. And this bladder then, as the fuel would come out of this particular compartment, the bladder would start collapsing, and so, you know, the whole tank wasn't exposed. You just had a little, you know, plastic bag in there, basically. This plane could exceed over 400 miles an hour. And so what the German planes would do is they would wait till we'd get to the extent of our range, because they knew where we had to turn back. And that's when they would attack our B-17s. And anyway, once we grabbed control of the air, that's when we decided we could do the Normandy invasion. Another big plane that we modified all through the war is a P-47. They called it the Jug. Now, we could go ahead and add the fuel tanks, etc., but it did not have the range. This was one particular plane that would fly into Germany and have to turn around and come back. But this plane, we used a lot for tank busting. We also used a lot for bombing. It was very well armored, and what gets me was they said, man, this thing could outdive anything. Well, look at it. Look how big it is in comparison to some of the other planes. I guess it would be able to outdive them. They just turned the nose down and let it rip. I mean, this thing is huge, and yeah, it would dive very well. The planes that the Germans had, and again, we got three and we're done. I can talk all day and I won't. But the German Messerschmitt, and I wanted to let you all see some of the camouflage. This would be like a winter color that they would use. The Germans had to camouflage everything they had because, again, we were gaining control of the air. They needed to hide their stuff. The only way to hide it was obviously with the camouflage. So with the snow on the ground, this is what they did. This was a division leader because he had the nose painted. If he's flying with his group and that, they want to know who the boss man is. So a lot of times the Germans would do that. This is a Faulky Wolf, which was to me an advancement over this particular plane. The advantage this plane had was the size, but this particular plane come on after the Messerschmitt. One of the things that the Germans did, which was to me very interesting again, was they had fuel injection in these planes. So, like during the Battle of Britain, what happened was the British, when they would turn their planes over like this, guess what happened? They would die on them. They would stall because they were just regular fuel injection. The Germans done come up with fuel injection. Does everybody know what they have in their car right now?
Right.
Is fuel injected. So the British and the Spitfires, they had the regular carburetors. And then finally, this is the ME-262. This was you know, it depends on who you talk to, but one of the first jets. But it was hands down the best jet. This thing could fly over 500 miles an hour. We kept, with the bombing that we were doing, we were keeping this plane suppressed into getting into service because we kept the Germans at bay this whole while. And so this plane didn't come out until late in the 44. But if it would have been in 41 or 42, we might all be speaking German right now. One of the things that Hitler wanted to do with this plane was he knew it was a bad boy. He wanted to use it for bombing. You know, the Air Force, the German Luftwaffe wanted to use it, you know, in air battles and that. So it was used both. Very ineffective bomber, because trying to bomb at 500 miles an hour, you just cannot be that accurate. And then I just brought in one of the shells that I wanted to show you, like a lot of these German planes would shoot, 20 millimeters and 30 millimeters. This is just the shell casing of a 20 millimeter shell. Isn't that huge? You know, so with a shell like this, can you imagine getting hit by something like that? One of the gentlemen I interviewed, and this was in Memphis, Tennessee, at Mud Island, was a rear gunner on the B-17 bomber there, and the name of the bomber was the Memphis Belle. And this gentleman was sitting there in his wheelchair and with his cane. And I was down there at that particular time. It was a fundraiser. I was playing ball, and I took a group of guys with me, and I interviewed this particular pilot. And very, very interesting. No matter who I talked to, no matter who I would interview, they always shot down more planes, you know, than they were credited for. And this gentleman had a couple kills, obviously, in a rear gunner. And if you got hit by one of these shells, especially on these B-17s, until this P-51 Mustang was able to come in and help these guys out, I mean, you couldn't hardly get 20 missions out of a B-17. And if you got hit by any of these 20, 30 millimeter shells that these Germans were shooting, it was so bad that a lot of times when they got back and the planes were damaged, that they would have to take a hose and wash out the body parts. And that's sad, but again, these shells are just so huge. And that's all I got to say.